Okay, welcome to another We the Govern production right in the middle of the COVID-19 virus pandemic shutdown in Washington State. And just for the clarity of our listeners here, this is not a Ministry of COVID Compliance approved production, but regardless, it's my honor here to be able to interview Representative Jim Walsh from the 19th Legislative District, who serves in Washington State's legislature and is on 2 of the 3 budget committees. And we're going to be discussing today the impact on Washington State's budget, the impact of these emergency proclamations. And with that, Representative Walsh, I just want to thank you for being here and taking the time to talk to our listeners and to give us your insight as kind of an inside player with what's going on. I know there's a number of legislators involved in that process, but I guess first talk about the emergency proclamation and probably many of the questions you're getting about that.
Sure, Glenn. Well, good to see you. Probably best to start with the broadest perspective. And this is a question that I get in person everywhere I go, on social media, and when I do talk radio, on regular media. All kinds of people ask the same question, and that is, okay, what's this emergency? How does it work? You know, does the legislature get to approve the governor's actions, and what's going on? What we have in the state of Washington, similar to many states, but particular in our own way, is a system where in a declared emergency, which the governor declares, certain administrative and legal tools become available to the governor. So the governor, under state law, can declare a situation, an emergency, make an emergency declaration. And that declaration is not time limited, and it doesn't really have any direct way of being checked by the legislature or even the judicial branch, although eventually the courts could jump in if they chose to.
And now with a bunch of lawsuits, they basically...
It's possible that might happen.
Right.
But the governor can declare the emergency, and then that declaration is in place as long as the underlying circumstances that caused the emergency declaration to be made are still in force, in place. So there's no set time limit on that emergency declaration. It can go on as long as it needs to go. Once the governor has declared that emergency, then a sort of specific toolkit of legal and administrative powers are opened to him or her. And these extraordinary powers are where a lot of the current focus of concern are. Now, these extraordinary powers include the ability to make proclamations, which are technically different than an executive order, but they act much as an executive order does, a little more powerfully, in fact. And these emergency proclamations basically fall into 2 sorts. An emergency proclamation made by the governor that directly suspends or overrides a specific section of state law has a 30-day time limit. And at the end of 30 days, if the governor wishes to continue that proclamation, which suspends some other specific part of state law, the governor has to go to the legislature and ask for the legislature's support of an extension of that proclamation.
And for clarity's sake, if the legislature is not in session, which we have a part-time legislature in Washington, correct, so we're only in session for short periods of time, usually beginning of the year, and they're not in session right now, then how does the legislature actually go about doing that?
The law speaks to this.
Okay.
If the legislature is not in session, a written approval, written authorization by the leaders of the 4 large caucuses in the legislature, that is, in the state Senate side, the majority leader and the minority leader, and on the state House side, the Speaker of the House and the minority leader, if all 4 of those individuals sign off on a written authorization for the governor to extend that proclamation, then it can be extended.
And each time, each extension is basically a 30-day extension. Is that kind of how it works?
Statute doesn't say how long it can be.
Okay.
The standard has been 30-day increments, but it could be shorter, and it could be longer. in a couple of the extensions that we've been dealing with during this COVID outbreak, the governor has asked for longer extensions, usually because there's some other deadline in the relevant statute and the relevant law that makes it a logical place to extend a suspension or a change to that law.
Okay.
So in some cases, he's asked for extensions that go more than 30 days.
Right.
But 30 days is kind of the rule of thumb, but it's not required.
Now, the question that probably comes up to you oftentimes is the constitutionality of the emergency proclamation in the beginning, and could you address that a little bit?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And there are lots. Well, but before we even get to that, we talked about the first category of proclamations.
Sure.
There's a second category of proclamations.
Okay.
And if a proclamation authorized under the emergency declaration does not specifically suspend or overturn another section of state law, the existing statute is moot. It's quiet on whether there's a 30-day limit to that or not. And this is the situation we're grappling with very directly during the COVID outbreak, when the governor has said that the majority of his most important, most striking proclamations, he has claimed fit under that category, where they do not suspend or overturn a specific section of state law, and therefore do not have the 30-day limit, are unlimited time-wise, as the underlying declaration of emergency is unlimited time-wise.
Okay.
And this gets to a point here in Washington on the governor's Stay Home, Stay Healthy proclamation. For those of you who like it this way, there's a number. That's Proclamation 20-25.
Okay.
And that is the most significant proclamation the governor has made during this emergency. And that is the lockdown order that he issued. And he has claimed, and his office, his lawyers have claimed, that because it doesn't address a specific piece of state law, it is instead a broader ban and prohibition on behaviors and activities,
right,
the 30-day limit doesn't apply. Now, I have been in a vocal minority from the start saying that that's wrong, that it does affect other statute,
right,
not explicitly, but implicitly, and certainly in practical terms.
Right.
And for that reason, that 30-day limit should have applied to the Stay Home, Stay Healthy proclamation. But at least initially, I was in a very small minority who were of that opinion. As we've gone on, more legislators are coming to my perspective on this, and they think that this Stay Home, Stay Healthy should have been bound by the time limit from the get-go.
And so there's this obvious, there's this little push-pull kind of going on right now in the legislature with the governor's office.
Well, we're trying to make it happen, Glenn.
Right.
I mean, the truth is, the statute is flawed in that it doesn't really allow the proper push-pull, or what I would call checks and balances,
right,
to operate during a declared emergency. It has been happening some in this COVID case in Washington because we kind of have made it. I mean, a few people have been legislators have been loud and objected from the start. And I've got to tell you, we've taken some flack for it, for not, we want people to die, which is a ludicrous, just a silly thing to say.
Right.
And we don't care for the old people, another silly thing to say. We care a lot for old people, we care a lot for young people, we care a lot for all people. Right. What we want is the proper system of checks and balances, which all government activity should have, and which we believe the spirit of our emergency declaration statutes does anticipate and does presume, but the wording and the structure of them has been silent in a way that it shouldn't be. So we've been up there banging our pots and having our rallies and working the Capitol, saying we will have checks and balances. And the governor has responded some. Early on, he lifted his ban on the real estate industry, which was in his original version of 2025. That was a good step. A little bit later, he loosened some of the bans he'd put on certain types of construction,
Right.
particularly residential construction. That was good. But all of this happened under intense pressure,
Right.
because we were out in the public talking to people about how wrong his steps were. More recently, he's loosened some of his prohibitions and bans on hunting and fishing and using some public
Sure.
land, and on he had a
Residential
crazy one.
construction. Yeah.
Right. The craziest one he had was he banned what he called elective procedures
Right.
at hospitals,
Right.
because he was anticipating a flood of COVID patients taking up all the beds in hospitals. The flood never came, and the hospitals, ironically, were left handcuffed and unable to do kind of the daily business of a hospital,
Right.
and ended up, ironically, laying off nurses and hospital staffers because they weren't doing anything.
Right in the middle of the pandemic.
I mean, in the middle of the pandemic,
Right,
the hospital had empty beds and
Right.
nobody there.
Right.
So we pressed the governor very hard on that issue, and he started to relax that ban, and now hospitals can get back to some of the standard business they do, and that's a good step. So there has been that give and take,
Right.
but it's been there because we've forced it. The governor doesn't like it, at least initially didn't react,
Right.
and his staff didn't react like they liked it. And their attitude was, well, you're being not a team player by questioning our edicts.
Right. Right.
And
right.
and my answer to them was, no, we're being exactly the team player
Right.
that is the legislature we're supposed to be,
Right.
by questioning your edicts.
Yeah, right. Right.
So we forced the checks and balances, and that's a good thing. Going forward, as we move away from this, we will have to address some of the constitutional issues.
Right.
And to me, the checks and balances are the most important. There are other more specific ones. Some of the governor's edicts have shut down retail gun sellers who have specific constitutional protections under the Second Amendment of the Federal Constitution and Article 1, Section 24 of the State Constitution.
Right.
Ditto churches. The governor's edicts have forced churches to not have their regular services, and they are also protected under the First Amendment, the Federal Constitution, and Article 1 of the State Constitution.
Right.
So those are specific constitutional problems with some of the measures that
Right.
the governor's taken. But then there's the broader question of proper checks and balances, and that just has to be there.
And whether he's enforced some of those or not, I mean, I know that they've banned assemblies, but at the same time they've had big protests, and unlike other states, he generally hasn't sicked the National Guard or SWAT teams on people.
Correct, and I mean that's to his credit.
Right.
To his
I
credit,
mean, they haven't done that.
some of those churches were very bold and had full services, but most did not. Most were compliant with the governor's edict, and but in the early days, the governor was saying that even the churches couldn't even bring in a small crew to do video, because most churches are trying to make their services available on video for members and parishioners to watch.
Right.
But they did loosen a little bit on that, and so most churches have gotten by doing video, but it's not the same. It's not as good, and there is clearly a constitutional tension there.
Right.
So the gun shops, the churches, there are certain kinds of businesses that have that constitutional protection that the governor's edicts, which are very blunt most of the time,
Right.
Not specific either geographically or by industry type,
Right.
have been too blunt and have not been effective. So there's some constitutional tension there, but the bigger constitutional tension really is in that matter of checks and balances.
Right.
This is the body of law in our state in Washington around the issue of disasters and declared emergencies is falls into two chapters of the state RCW, the Revised Code of Washington, chapters 42 and mostly chapter 43 of the RCW. And you have to kind of scroll through 43. It's about several things, but the disaster powers is one of the sections.
Right, and historically it's always been applied locally. It's not been applied at a state level. Like they'd have a flood in Skagit County and they would define that for the county, and then that would actually open the door to federal funds and other types of relief.
The governor is the one who declares it,
Right.
but he has traditionally declared it for specific areas, specific circumstances.
Right.
This is not completely unique, but a rare situation where it was declared to the whole state.
Right.
And more importantly, most of the disasters that were anticipated in the drafting of these couple of statutes that address these matters were of immediate import. That is, they were things like a flood, a landslide,
A volcano.
a volcanic explosion.
Mount St. Helens blows up,
Mount St.
right.
Helens was a classic one.
Right.
A tsunami,
Right.
an earthquake, very specific, often natural disasters. Some, if you go deep enough into this statute, to when most of this we added to the statute in the state within about the last 20 years, but some of it goes back farther than that. It goes back into the late 60s, early 70s. And some of that anticipated, frankly, kind of Cold War, nuclear disaster
sure.
things.
Yeah.
But in all these cases, these were matters of immediate import. That
Right.
is a disaster, either natural or man-made, that would cause a period of upheaval and uncertainty of some days or maybe a couple of weeks. Frankly, it's my opinion, having read the statute and the history of it, it wasn't anticipated that these declarations would go on in these sort of chronic issues.
Right. As long as the governor felt like it.
And that the reason that there weren't clear time limits put on the declaration of an emergency is it was always anticipated this would be like a 10 days
Right.
or maybe a couple of weeks. What we have with the COVID viral outbreak is a situation where this is open-ended.
Right.
I mean, we're going on 60 days into the beginning of the state's response to COVID,
Right.
and there's really no end in sight.
Right.
The governor has recently come up with some suggested kind of steps
Very
for
nebulous,
merging,
though. He's
but
not-
they're no hard timeline.
Right.
And I don't mean to sound completely demeaning of his efforts. Putting together the steps for emerging from this is a good idea.
Right.
He's recently spoken of doing a little more geographic specificity,
Right.
which is critically important.
Right.
As I was saying, is that blunt approach, that one-size-fits-all approach, no good.
Right.
So if he's open to modifying the proclamations to specific counties, depending on how much of COVID incidents they've had, how many deaths they've had,
Right.
that's entirely appropriate. So the governor has taken some better steps, but the timing is still very vague, very nebulous, as
Right.
you say. And we're 60 days in almost. We could easily be another 60 days through,
Right.
and we could be 90 or 120 days through.
Right.
By the time this is all done, we could be 6 months in this
Right.
declared emergency. And it is my impression from having read the statute and the legislative history of the statute that was not the intent.
Right.
The idea was, okay, there's been an earthquake, the governor needs to execute some decisions very quickly, and we want to give him latitude to do that. Not this ongoing, months-long kind of dragged-out process where the governor is doing things that I just don't believe are anticipated by the statute.
Right.
Picking winners and losers.
Right.
Calling people essential or non-essential.
Right. Yeah, which is a Schindler's List reference.
I mean, it's horrible.
Yeah.
And it's always surprised me through the process that the governor's staff has had kind of a tin ear to some of the
Right.
secondary meanings of some of their rhetoric and the language they've used.
And even hostile. I mean, I've seen his postman, right? He's gotten up and he's just been vicious and hostile and very demeaning towards the people who are clearly being harmed by this legislation. I mean, with just no concern at all.
The shocking part was when they first put in the Stay Home, Stay Healthy proclamation, again,
Right.
2025, they took a hard line particularly about restaurants and bars. And that, frankly, that was okay because they were meeting places with large groups of people. And,
Right.
and certainly at the beginning of this process, few could argue that was a legitimate order.
So we were facing millions of people dying.
So,
right.
okay.
Yeah.
But then they and some of the staff of the governor were shocked to find out that the restaurants and bars then laid people off.
Right.
They thought that the small businesses were just going to keep their employees on while they were shut down.
Right.
And it showed a naivete and frankly a sort of denseness about how the real world works.
Right, and they do that in government, of course. You can shut the government down, and they'll send the employees home, pretend like it's a furlough, and pay them the whole time like nothing happened. But that's not actually how the real world works.
You're running a pub or a small restaurant. You can't afford to do that. You're going to lay your employees off.
Yeah, or a landscaping company, anything really. Yeah.
And as some of these small business owners have said, it was the best thing to do for the employees.
Right.
Lay them off quickly and let them get on unemployment, which became overrun more than the governor expected.
Right.
But from the small employer's perspective, it was, well, look, they're shutting me down. I'm laying you off. Go get your unemployment benefits.
Right.
And that's a rational response.
Right.
But the fact that it caught the governor's office by surprise is what is telling. They just have no. There's no. What the Israelis call the 10th man. Mm-hmm. You should always have on your staff one dissenter who doesn't agree with what everybody else is agreeing to. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that the governor's office lacks a 10th man.
Yeah,
there's nobody there to say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't such a good idea.
Well, and I noticed he said he was creating these committees to look at this reopen, and one of the questions that came up, and I can't remember, I think it was Cairo who actually asked this. It was a great question. He never answered it either. They said, well, how do you put together these groups of people? I mean, is there any diverse thinking or, and of course, he plays like dumb and he says he has no idea.
Yes.
But the reality is,
it's very diverse. We have the left and the far left.
Right, it's just groupthink. And there will be no independent thought, no unique, nobody there who's going to have any idea what they're doing. They're just going to all think the same. And so therefore, their prescriptions, if they're going to be flawed, no one will even see it coming, right? And then that's a concern I had for that. Okay, so I know one of the questions that come up periodically is, and especially right now, I hear all the time, is how constitutional is this? Does the Washington State Constitution justify it? Can you address that for our listeners?
Sure. The declaration of an emergency is constitutional, and it's covered by both statute, RCW, and the state constitution.
Which doesn't mean everything the governor's doing is constitutional.
No, the actions he's taking. Remember, the declaration is kind of the opening gambit, and then that opens up a toolkit of powers that he has. Most of the immediate questions about constitutionality are those specific tools in the toolkit that opens up.
Right.
The controlling mechanism, the declaration of the emergency, that is clearly constitutional. Mm-hmm. It's addressed in our state constitution and in state law. There have been some refinements recently that have, in fact, kind of concentrated more power in the governor's office and even in the legislature, some, for periods of declared emergency.
Right.
Just recently, last year, the legislature passed a Senate Joint Resolution 8200, SJR 8200, which was the form of a constitutional amendment to the state constitution. It passed through both chambers of the legislature, then went to the people in November of 2019.
And you voted against that?
On the floor of the House, I was against it, and one of the few. Most of the House members were for it from both parties.
Yeah,
the Senate was a little more.
I voted against it too, but I didn't. It seemed like it kind of snuck up on us, and I'm a pretty active guy, and I didn't really pay that much attention to it. So.
And no one did, frankly.
Yeah.
That election cycle was dominated by the $30 car tabs initiative, and after that by the referendum 88, which was an affirmative action referendum.
Right.
Those two kind of sucked up all the attention,
and
this SJR 8200 kind of, like you say, kind of slipped in under the radar.
Right.
It was couched in a way that sounded reasonable, but what it did was it concentrated some additional powers, in that case, to both the governor and to the legislature during a period of declared emergency. Now, it did not have a really direct bearing on the issues we're seeing, the constitutional problems in this declared emergency on COVID-19.
Okay.
People are a little misguided on that. They think that there was a direct tie between the governor's constitutionally dubious actions during the COVID outbreak and that 8200. There's not really a direct tie, but I would say this. The fact that constitutional amendment passed by a pretty large margin just a few months ago made the governor, I think, a little more arrogant in how he went about issuing proclamations in COVID, because he was sort of full of the idea that, well, the people have just approved more concentrated power,
Right.
so they will support me in
Right.
doing these things. It's not a direct causal link or legal link, but I think there was a political and maybe even sort of psychological element
Sure.
to it, adding to the governor's likelihood to proceed aggressively on the COVID-19 outbreak.
Okay.
So we need to reform all these things going forward.
Which kind of gets to the next question. Right now, we're in the middle of experiencing this. I know there's been a blizzard of litigation.
Right.
A bunch of your fellow colleagues have filed a lawsuit.
3 major lawsuits so far.
Right.
One filed by Joshua Freed
Right.
against the governor about his COVID-19 responses.
Mm-hmm.
Freed's lawsuit focuses very tightly on the church issues.
Right.
And in some ways, it may be the strongest lawsuit because it is so narrowly focused,
Right.
and makes what I think is a pretty strong argument that the governor overstepped in banning church services.
And that's a federal lawsuit.
These are all 3 federal lawsuits,
Yeah, yeah.
the 3 major ones that I know of. The second one was a federal lawsuit filed by Tim Eyman and Clint Didier, the county commissioner out of Franklin County in the Tri-Cities area.
Yeah, and I don't think Tim Eyman was a plaintiff, right? It was he announced it, but it was like Clint Didier and
And
some
a
other
group
employees.
of others. And,
Right.
But the group that arranged it was sort of the Eyman Didier group.
Right.
And company.
Yeah.
A few other people were involved there, and good people.
Yeah.
That's broader than the first one.
Right.
It looks to really overturn basically the whole show that the
Essential
governor-
versus non-essential,
Correct.
and how do you make that definition?
and it takes the form. They're trying to create it as a class action lawsuit,
Mm-hmm.
so they're inviting people to join and want it to be as broad based as it can be. Then most recently, just a few days ago, as we're talking today,
Right.
a group of Republican legislators,
Mm-hmm.
I was not part of it, but others were, filed a similar lawsuit against the governor
Right.
for some of the manner in which he's put together his COVID-19 overreach. It's narrower than the Didier-Eyman group, but not as narrow as the Freed lawsuit.
Right. So those are the 3 federal cases.
Correct.
And now I know there was another case filed in Lewis County early this week by Joel Ard, the attorney I was
Right.
interviewing last week, about the paramount duty of the state for schools and whether
Correct.
the governor has the right to shut them down. And that'll be another interesting case. Now that's going to stay in state court. So
And there may be a couple others like it.
Right.
There's been a sort of grassroots effort, particularly looking at the shutdown of the schools.
Right.
So that case, I believe, was the first one of that sort, but there may be others.
Several of them, sure.
And then they'll probably have to put them together and,
Right.
and consider them in a consolidated case.
So we'll see if I know under the McCleary decision, which is what it greatly expanded school funding and was kind of a leverage point against the legislature, and that was the big decision that the paramount duty of the state for public education. If that's the case, we'll see if the Supreme Court's consistent in saying that it really is indeed the paramount duty of the state to go forward. So this is the middle. I mean, if you're in the legislature, there's probably discussions with other colleagues about maybe coming back and re-looking at some on the laws as they've been written about emergency declarations. Because I just get the sense when this has come up before, nobody's really thought of it as this kind of a situation that we're
Correct.
in right now. I don't
the
think
length of time.
Right, nobody expected something like that. I mean, the short term, we've had floods, we've had volcanoes, and tsunami has always been a constant threat, and earthquakes, and all those things in Washington State. We know that, but nobody probably anticipated this kind of an application of the law. And so I imagine that there's going to be some effort in the legislature to make some changes.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the first thing that will happen, I mean, I know it's going to happen because I've already drafted one of the bills, it will be to clarify the confusing language in RCW 43 on that time limit on proclamations once the emergency's been declared.
Right.
We need to do away with the vagueness that some may not apply, some proclamations may not apply to the 30-day time limit.
Right.
We need to be clear, all proclamations are controlled by a 30-day time limit.
Right.
And in fact, I don't think it should be 30 days. I think it should be 10 days.
Right.
Give the governor 10 days of discretion, but if any of these proclamations is going to live longer than 10 days, the
Legislature needs
legislation must be consulted.
What about the requirement that the legislature has to be called back into session if they aren't, and therefore formally vote on these so that there's a record for this support? Because I know that's been a critique as well. There's this nebulous, unclear support.
Four corners letter, right?
Right.
The four corners being the leaders of the four caucuses.
Right.
Yes, that's a reform that should be required also.
Okay.
I'm more focused personally on the timelines because that's where I think most of the damage has been done so far.
Okay.
This nebulous, vague time, and we want to extend, and we're not sure, and it could be 4 phases, and I don't know, and we need to have evidence, and we need to have data. No, we'd like to know the time. Give us particulars.
Right.
What's the time? What's the geographic limit of an order? We want to know that this is indeed a well-targeted, well-focused action that's worthy of support, not some ongoing, log-rolling, continuing crisis, which is the risk that we're in right now with the COVID reactions. There's a lot of cynicism, frankly, growing in the state that this is, started out as a legitimate emergency declaration, but is kind of morphing into something different. A political ploy that could last through the election cycle.
Sure.
We're in an election year this year.
Right.
And will this thing get drawn out to October or November?
Right. Are there political machinations going on that the governor's clearly using to pick winners and losers, punish political enemies, reward political allies? I mean, and he even brought up in his last public hearing where he's like, politics is being played. It's just the pot calling the kettle black.
He's calling names. He's calling people biologically ignorant and humanely heartless. I mean, that's not appropriate to a discussion of public policy to help people through a viral outbreak.
Especially when so many people are being impacted so dramatically. Which is actually, I think, a good segue to the next discussion, which really should be about how is this going to affect Washington State's budget.
Yes, and this is the most important issue probably in the whole thing. First of all, the good news is we're on the down slope of the COVID outbreak. And COVID, like most viruses, is following a fairly predictable kind of bell-shaped curve how it works its way through the population. And this goes back 150 years. A fellow called Farr, an early epidemiologist scientist in England looking at smallpox, came up with what they call Farr's law, which is that bell curve. And viruses, other epidemics tend to follow it. And it really is one of those reliable mathematical models. And when we talked about bending the curve, which was flattening out the bell curve of Farr's law in order to not overwhelm our hospitals in the state with COVID patients, that was legitimate and science-based. That was a legitimate concern to have. But as we know, what's happened is the flood of COVID patients in the hospitals never came. And so we're at the point now where we're clearly on the downslope of the Farr's law curve. And this is the time where we have to be looking forward past the COVID outbreak into what's next. And the what's next is going to be a huge budget impact for the state of Washington. What we are facing after, as we're working on 60 days into basically a man-made recession, economic shutdown, and with no clear path in sight for how quickly we're going to get back to business as usual and commerce and industry working.
Assuming we can get back exactly to that.
That we ever do. Yeah, good point. What is this going to do to the state's economy and the state's budgets? I mean, the state has 3 budgets. In Washington, we have 3 state budgets. The largest by far is the operating budget.
And that's the one they usually talk about as the $55 million biennium budget.
Right. That's a good point. We work on a 2-year budget cycle, so you'll hear the term biennium thrown around a lot. Most of the numbers we're talking about here are for 2-year periods. So yes, the operating budget recently was as high as $55 billion, state of Washington only, for 2 years. We also have the transportation budget, which comes in at about $20 billion for 2 years.
Okay.
And then the third budget is the state capital budget, which is much smaller and comes in at about $8 billion for 2 years, 7 or 8 billion. So,
and explain what the capital budget is for
the capital budget is it's interesting. It is the infrastructure building budget.
Okay.
Sometimes you hear it referred to as the capital construction budget.
Sure.
And it is it funds states' construction projects. So hard infrastructure,
non-transportation,
not roads and bridges. That's
Right.
in transportation.
Right.
But hard assets. So buildings, mostly schools.
Okay.
The schools are funded in part with local tax
Right.
dollars, but the state matches through a program called SCAP and through other programs. The state matches building budgets for local school districts.
Okay.
So when a school district passes a local construction bond to build a new elementary school, the funds raised by local taxpayers in that district for that bond pay for part of the building of the new school.
Sure.
And then the state matches.
Okay.
And the amount that the state matches varies depending on a formula that has to do with the size of the school district and other factors. But it can be quite a bit that the state chips in to match the local portion.
Okay.
And that's the biggest piece of the capital construction budget, as it should be. And then there are various other projects for state matching local building projects that could be anything from restoring a historic courthouse to helping build a new city hall to various construction projects.
Okay.
And the state usually likes to see local first dollars, and then the state comes in with matching dollars.
And you sit on
also a lot of housing, a lot of low-income housing.
Oh, that's right,
and
'cause that's
homeless
being
housing
subsidized in there.
all
Okay.
comes through this capital budget too.
And you sit on two of those committees. You sit on the transportation and the capital budget. But when you look at the impact of the event that we're occurring right now, this emergency declaration and all the shutdown, the source of tax revenue coming into Washington State comes from sales tax, B&O tax, and sales excise tax and property tax, right?
Right. It's about, if you think of it like a pie chart,
Yeah.
it's about 1/3 property tax to the state. Now, when you pay your property tax bill, some of that money goes directly to your county
Right.
and local
Fire
jurisdictions,
departments and all that stuff, yeah.
but then some goes to the state.
Right.
So the state portion of property taxes counts for about 1/3 of the state's biannual budget.
And mostly going into
resources.
the general fund.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then about 2/3 come from a variety of other sources. Sales tax probably being the largest, B&O tax being another significant one, and then various other excise taxes,
Right.
Gasoline taxes, various other taxes. So think of it about 1/3 property, 2/3 sales and B&O and related.
Yeah.
And now the thing is that 1/3 from property taxes, it's kind of a lagging indicator on the economy in general. It's not as fluctuating
Right.
as the others are. It's steadier. That's why a lot of people like property taxes as a form of taxation because it's steady.
Right.
And it's a baseline. It does move. It can move up and down, but it tends to do so slowly.
Right.
It's predictable. Whereas the others, the excise taxes, sales taxes, B&O taxes, business and occupation is B&O tax,
Right.
are all much more immediately tied to the performance of the economy. So when we have a situation like we've had the last few months of a man-made shutdown to the economy,
A real flat line.
you're going to
Yeah.
see
Yeah.
sales tax and B&O tax and excise taxes plummet.
Right.
And so the question isn't, are they going down? It's how much are they going down?
Right.
And so this is going to affect the state's operations, not immediately this month, although some starting to,
Right.
but definitely a few months out and into the next year to 2 years
Right.
are really where we're looking. And it's in that we budget on a 2-year cycle in Olympia, but we also do a 4-year outlook on budget issues.
Okay.
And this is because most budget gnomes agree that that's the 4-year time frame is how you should plan a budget.
Okay.
2 sets of 2-year budgets. And the 4-year outlook is going to take a hit from the current shutdown. And we don't even know how much of a hit, because we're, as we've said, we're 60 days into a kind of manufactured closure. This could create a recession that goes on for another 6 months or a year.
Right.
And will be affecting tax revenues on that sales tax and B&O tax for another year, 2 years, even 3 years.
And we know, like, the Office of Financial Management recently came out, and every time they talk now with these vague kind of, I know that June is when they come out with their kind of hard and fast,
Correct.
here's the numbers, but they're coming out and they're saying we're going to lose $6 billion, no, we're going to lose $7 billion, no, we're going to, who knows?
Well, there have been a couple of estimates so far on the financial hit. OFM, the Office of Financial Management, which operates under the governor, it's part of the executive branch,
right,
has done one, and they estimated it was going to be about I think it was $6.6 billion.
And I will point out, you did put in a bill to move that out of the governor's office, didn't you? This last year?
I did last session. It didn't get much traction.
No, but I like that idea. I think that needs to be removed from the governor's office. Unfortunately, I don't think they're doing the job they should be. But
OFM does a lot of things.
Yeah.
It builds the budgets that the governor asked the legislature to pass.
Right.
But we've had a one-party rule for so long in Olympia that process has become kind of ossified. Mm-hmm. You know, the majorities in the same side of the aisle with the governor take the governor's suggestions pretty much as Bible and run with them.
Right.
Whereas that process is supposed to be a little more checks and balances.
Right.
Anyway, so OFM builds budgets for the governor, who then requests the legislature to pass those budgets. Mm-hmm. The Office of Financial Management also does various sorts of projections on budget outlook. They also do fiscal notes
on bills.
On bills.
Right, which can be the life or death of that bill based on whatever they come up and say.
And fiscal notes are the fiscal impact prediction on what a bill will do. So I feel very strongly that those activities ought to be not controlled by the executive branch.
Right.
But they ought to be controlled by the legislative branch, since they affect the legislative process.
And because OFM oftentimes seems like they game the bills. If they don't like the bill, or the governor doesn't like the bill, they give it an artificial inflation of the actual cost of that bill. If he loves the bill, they make it
shrink
seem
it down.
Yeah, they make it seem like it's not going to cost anything. So I really feel like OFM's been one of those agencies I've been wanting to audit, a deep dive audit for a long time. So
well, I'll keep pushing. We need to get that office over to the legislature. Have the legislature.
But either way, wherever it's located, there's a fiscal.
So they've done an estimate. I think their number was $6.6 billion. There's separately a commission. Mm-hmm. Which is of appointed economists and experts by the legislature, that also looks at tax forecasting.
Right.
So and they've also come out with a kind of, they haven't done the official one, which they'll do in June, but they've come up with another estimate. It was about the same range. There was a little more, about $7 billion.
Right.
So this is the estimate, these 7 billion. These are the estimates for the shortfall, the reduction.
Right.
In tax collection for a period. They're looking at that 4-year cycle I'm talking about, but we're actually kind of a year into the current one, so it's more like a 3-year cycle.
So to complete the rest of the year and the next two, they say that right now they're admitting at least that it looks like $7 billion, and I know I've heard estimates where it could be $10 billion, it could be worse. I mean, we don't really know.
Yes, and I think you should consider, and there have been discussions in Olympia about this already. Mm-hmm. I think you should consider the number $7 billion over this kind of 3-year period, biennium plus a little bit, the low end.
Right.
That would be a decrease in tax receipts of something like 10%, a little bit less than 10%. You should think about that as the low end.
It's the best case scenario the state's going to have. Yeah.
I think that it is possible that we could see a drop of 15 to 20%.
Right.
I think it's also possible to be higher than 20%. You start probably unlikely that much of a cut, but I think if you wanted a ballpark, I would say 10 to 20%
of a cut in budget.
That's realistic.
Right. And then especially considering, I know with just the unemployment numbers that are coming in the state, 20% unemployment numbers is what it looks like right now. And there's been a lot of complaints that a lot of the people who are unemployed can't even get through to the unemployment office.
That's a whole nother issue.
Right, we don't even know how much those numbers are. Right. So there was an article that Representative Harmsworth, one of former colleagues, former Representative Harmsworth, for the Washington Policy Center recently, mentioning that the unemployment insurance fund is going to be out of money by the end of May because in the last couple of payments they've spent more than they had budgeted for all year. I mean, it's just this massive increase in unemployment.
Oh yeah, I mean, you were hearing the agency that handles unemployment insurance in the state of Washington is the Employment Security Department, ESD. Anybody who's ever applied for unemployment knows ESD.
Right.
And they were overwhelmed. At one point, I heard one of their people saying that they had received as many unemployment claims in 1 week as they usually saw in a year.
Right.
Now, I don't know if that was strictly true or a little bit of an exaggeration, but they've been overwhelmed.
Yeah,
the hospitals weren't overwhelmed,
right?
But the ESD was overwhelmed.
That's right. Well, I know that. I mean, even you see tons of posts of people who aren't even able to get in there and apply, or
literally. Well, they had to take their website down for a little while because, per a deal with the feds, they changed the parameters for who qualifies.
Right.
Traditionally, in our state, if you were self-employed, sole practitioner, contract worker, you didn't qualify for unemployment if you ran out of work. The feds threw some money in and said, but open it up to people who are self-employed.
Right.
And so it took them a little. They had to take their website down and kind of rejigger their forms and things.
Right.
And so that got people all twisted up because the site was down.
Right.
But that had been predicted, and they said they were going to have to do it. However you measure it, they were overwhelmed. And they did get the self-employed and the sole practitioners included, but that only increased the wave of people applying for unemployment benefits. People have rightly been frustrated at this and the application process, but they worked out their kinks, and they are processing the applications more quickly, and they will grandfather in or make retroactive the unemployment payments to the time that the person was unemployed. So in the end, people will get their benefit, but it's going to take a little time to get there. The concerns that some have about that unemployment fund running out of money are a little bit overblown. As we mentioned a bit ago, this is one of those things where the feds have a deal with the states, where the feds will loan money to the state to cover a shortfall in an unemployment insurance account.
Right.
And this has existed before COVID.
Right, long time.
And it's been the standard procedure for a while. Because of the spikiness in economic cycles, states can't always completely anticipate. I mean, it hasn't been about a problem as this, but in the past there have been spikes that weren't anticipated.
Right.
And so the feds loan money to the state to keep the account flush, which they will do, and the feds have the capacity to do. But those funds, at least traditionally, did have to be repaid with interest.
Right.
So now the conversations between the feds and the state, it's possible some of these COVID-related loans will be forgiven, or the interest will be forgiven, and so the blow will be softened. But that doesn't help the big
budget.
Picture.
Right. Yeah. The big budget problems.
So we're looking at, so our estimates are low end 8 to 10% of a cut in tax revenue, high end as high as 20%, could even be higher, but 20 is probably the upper limit.
Right.
And this is going to require real work on the part of the legislature. It's our job to make budgets in this state.
And that's going to happen quickly, because this isn't one of these things where it's a slow motion train wreck. It's happened fast.
The train is off the rails already.
Right.
And we're still sitting on the train. We're in our cars sitting on the train.
Yeah.
But it's off the rails, and we got to act quickly. There probably will be a special session called sometime after the next scheduled tax forecast, which is in mid-June. So there'll probably be a special session sometime after that, and we're going to have to start making cuts and adjustments to our state budgets. So we've talked about the three budgets, but let's focus primarily on the operating budget, the biggest one.
Right.
Currently running at an amount about 55 to 56 billion per 2-year cycle. Break that down, you're in the range of about 28 billion a year.
Right.
We're looking at a shortfall estimated to be on the low end $7 or $8 billion over kind of a 2-year cycle plus a little bit. So you're looking at a hit of maybe something like $2 billion maybe a little more on a $27 billion budget.
Right.
So you're looking at a cut, again, like we've been saying, 8%, 10%. In the last 25 years, the only time that we cut the budget in the state of Washington by anything like that, by anything at all really,
Right.
were in the couple of years, 2-year budget cycles after the 2008 recession.
Right.
And in that case, over a two-year budget cycle period, over 4 years,
Right.
we cut approximately 8% from
Okay.
the budget. And that the budget was much smaller in those days. It was in the mid-30s billion dollars
Total
per
for
2-year
2 years,
cycle.
yeah.
So we cut then an amount, about 3.5-4 billion over a 4-year cycle. So about 10%, a little bit less actually, more like 8% over a 4-year cycle.
Right.
We may have to cut that much in 1 or 2 years as a result of the current shortfall. And that's going to be more harder work than the legislature has had to do in the 25 years that I've been tracking this stuff.
Right.
And certainly since the 2000s, so certainly in the 10, 12 years since the last recession. So this was the day that a lot of us were predicting and dreading. We dreaded for years that the regular economic cycle was going to run to recession at some point.
Right.
And here we have this perfect storm of economic trouble with the COVID virus, the shutdown, and then a long-term trend toward a recession anyway.
Right.
This is it.
Right.
We're here and we're going to have to really look at cuts, not the cut in growth,
Right.
which is an old trick that government budget makers always make, that a cut in the rate of growth equals a cut.
Right.
That's not what we're talking about here.
Right,
We're
right.
talking about real cuts.
Right. People getting laid off, department ending, programmatic cuts.
And you never like to do this.
Right.
But there's going to have to be some real reckoning in our state budgeting process. And
the rainy day fund is gone. I mean, there's
well, I mean, there's still some money in it, but the rainy day fund isn't really designed to take on this kind of shortfall.
Right.
We moved some money out of the rainy day fund into the general fund at the end of the last session, and that was right to do, anticipating the COVID issues. We can move some more. Right. That'll soften the blow. But the rainy day fund at max is going to get you a couple billion.
Right.
And we're looking at the possibility,
4 times that
right,
much.
of a $7 or $8 billion shortfall.
Right.
And it's just not.
If things are good,
Right. They could be worse.
Right.
So the rainy day fund will help. It'll soften the blow, but the blow is still coming. And we're going to have to really look at our state agencies, our state government, and we're going to have to look for efficiency. And one of the silver linings to the COVID shutdown is most state employees are working from home already anyway.
Right.
And this may help agencies find efficiency. I mean, maybe working from home can be more of a regular thing. Maybe office space can be downsized. Maybe cross-training, which some agencies are having to do, can be done more so that people are trained to do a couple of different things for a state government agency they work for than just do one thing.
Well, and I know I've put out already, that maybe we don't need Evergreen State College. There are
going to have to be some broad cuts.
I mean, Puget Sound Partnership is a good one to look at, or Department of Ecology probably could be downsized in a fairly significant way. I mean,
one of the bill that my colleague Jesse Young and I have worked on, which is going by the name Boise, the Boise Plan. It's not Boise, Idaho. It's an acronym for a couple of changes we want to see coming out of this lockdown. Includes a B&O tax cut for businesses, but it also includes regulatory streamlining. That's the EC part, Boise. And that would basically enforce a more modest approach for agencies like the Department of Ecology, for Puget Sound Partnership, for LNI. And that would enforce some reduction in their breadth of activity and would allow for some rationalizing and streamlining of their operations. And I should say too, I just got recently, I was doing a talk radio segment, and we got some calls about the Department of Fish and Wildlife, which is become very top heavy with supervisors of supervisors who supervise, and
Right.
trainers of trainers who train.
Right.
And I think there's room for efficiency in that agency without affecting the frontline employees
Right.
who are actual, game wardens and enforcement
Right.
officers,
People
and,
actually doing
and
something.
biologists who are actually studying how the fish are going.
Right.
Those people I think you could leave alone largely, but press some efficiency at the top end of that organization.
And I know DSHS looking at them in the
Very
past,
much the same way.
top heavy ESDs. I mean, there's all kinds of opportunities.
We are at the end. We had a great run. I mean, from the 2008 recession through the 2010s into 2020, we had a long run of an expanding economy where the old paradigm was, if in doubt, just budget up because
Right.
there's going to be more money. And for almost 10 years, quarter to quarter, we outpaced our projected tax receipts.
state did.
The state did
Right.
because the state was booming. Things
Right.
were going well. Well, now
happening now.
that old paradigm is gone.
Right.
And there's going to have to be a new paradigm, which is familiar to fiscal conservatives, but not really familiar to the tax and spend crowd.
Right.
They're going to have to look at real net cuts
Significant cuts.
and efficiencies, forced efficiencies on state agencies.
And that's going to translate all the way down to local government. We're seeing city of Tacoma, we're seeing Kent, we're seeing Snohomish County already doing layoffs, pay cuts.
And they're the smart ones.
I know.
They're the ones who can see which way the wind's blowing.
Right. Because
Some of them aren't there yet.
Right.
And back to what we said earlier about the private sector companies letting people go, sometimes that's the kindest thing to do. It's like, look, there's a storm on the horizon. Not only are we not hiring anymore, we're
gotta lay
asking
off.
people to leave, and
Right.
we're laying people off.
Right.
And we want you to get out there, get into the job market and find something, because there's a storm coming and we're going to have cuts.
Right.
And I think it's never pleasant. It's always painful. But I
Right.
think those local entities that are moving fast are doing the right thing,
Right.
the humane thing,
Right.
not only for their taxpayers, but also for their employees.
Well, if you had anything that you wanted to share with our listeners before we close today, I know we've been talking for a while, and it's just good. Is there a message that you would have for other people who are concerned, looking at how this could change government? Any suggestions that you would have for them, over the next few months?
Well, hold on. It's going to be a tough couple of months. It's probably be a tough year or so.
Right.
But the fundamentals, I sound like an old guy, politician from the 20s. The fundamentals of our state's economy and the prospects here are very solid. If we don't do anything foolish, we have certain structural advantages in the fact we don't have an income tax in this state, in the fact of we're just blessed with some things like geographic location,
Strong agricultural sector.
and the ag
High-tech.
industry. I mean, we have a good mix of industry. We have a good position in the globe. We have, and we have, although we're known as kind of a blue-leaning state, we've always been fairly fiscally responsible until very lately.
Right.
For instance, our public employee pension funds are relatively well-funded. We don't have the looming crisis that states like Illinois or New York or California have.
Yeah.
So we just need to get back to those roots. I mean, we can still be a progressive state, but we need that fiscal conservative tip. And that's what's going to be, I think, the controlling dialogue in Olympia for the next probably couple of years.
Right.
You really want that fiscal conservatism. We're going to have it because of the reduction in tax receipts. And we want to apply the same essential, non-essential eye to our state functions that we've applied to private functions.
Yeah, that Inslee decided to arbitrarily apply to the rest of us.
If we're going to do this, we got to do it everywhere.
Right.
But really, I think what it comes down to is it's going to be, it's going to be a silver lining, because I think it's going to force us to review efficiencies in how our state budgets and our state operates that takes a minimal impact on the services that we deliver, on the roads and bridges that we take care of, on the good policy that we do, but gets rid, frankly, of some of the heaviness on the the high end of the org chart at a number of agencies. And then we're probably going to have to look at kicking loose some entities that are going another direction anyway, like the Evergreen State College. And I mean, that again, those are problems that predated COVID.
Right.
But I think that'll
just made it worse.
It'll force some decisions there that were coming anyway, and we'll need to make those decisions now.
I want to thank you for taking the time. Let me come out here in the middle of this lockdown, come to your house and violate Inslee's social distancing norms. But and I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. And good luck in the legislature. And we'll be looking forward to talking to you at the Caper Zoom meeting that we're going to be having next week.
Next week.
Yep.
Well, we'll keep pushing. We'll keep pushing, Glenn. It's what I know to do, and I'm going to continue pushing for better policy and more transparency and fiscal conservatism.
All right. Thank you.